Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining us for this new webinar co-organized by IDDRI and the Canadian Embassy in Paris. We are thrilled and honored to have a very exciting panel to share with you today with experts from South and Southeast Asia with us. And we are here to discuss about the ambition for COP15 in the region. I won't say much about the substance and overall importance of this dialogue because it's the next speaker that I'll have the honor to give the floor to right after I mention some more technical aspects of the webinar. Just to before I go into that, I'd just like to thank all of our panelists and give you a short overview of the program. And before I forget, because this is an important element, you have direct interpretation from in French and English inside the. If you have the Zoom application, it's right at the bottom of your screen. Et je vais le dire en français pour les francophones qui sont avec nous. N'oubliez pas que vous avez l'interprétation de l'anglais vers le français qui est disponible si vous avez l'application Zoom. Il suffit d'aller en bas de votre écran. Vous avez une petite planète avec des rayures avec interprétation écrit dessus et vous pouvez basculer d'un stream, d'un fil de son à l'autre pendant le webinaire. Donc, back to English. And while we're on these logistical points, please ask your questions in the Q&R space at the bottom of the Zoom window. And we will have a Q&A segment at the end of the webinar, and we will try to address as many questions as we can with the time that we will have left. So today we're very happy to have three experts from the region, plus of course, last but not least, Basile van Havre, one of the co-chairs of the post-2020 working group. And so in order of the presentation, right after me, for the more substantial point, we will have Dr. Vinod Mathur, who's from India, who's the chairman of the National Biodiversity Authority in India. Thank you so much for being with us today. Then we will have a point made, an update of the process, because as you know, everything is shifting all the time. And so it's very important as to level the field so that we're on the same page to hear from Basile van Havre the last updates on the COP15 process and his own views on the coming year. We'll then have Dr. Teresa Lim, who's with us. Teresa is the Executive Director of the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, and she's also the former chair of the CBD Substa. And so thank you so much for your presence. And we're eager to hear about your views. And last but not least, we have Dr. Sunitha Subramanian, who's a Senior Research Fellow at the United Nations University Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies. I'm sorry, I never know where to stop with the IIS, but you, you can tell us more precisely later. So that's the series. So Dr. Vinod will right after me, make some more substantial introductory remarks. Basile will then jump in from his desk to provide an update on the process. And then we will have two presentations by Dr. Teresa and Dr. Sunitha. And after that, we will have a discussion among the panelists and then switch to a Q&A with the audience. So bear with us. And if you have burning questions coming during the discussions, please write them down in the Q&A, sorry, I'm mixing with the French, Q&A window chat box, and we will process them on the way and try to answer as many as we can. So without further ado, Dr. Vinod, you have the floor, and thank you so much again for being with us.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you, Aleksandar, for providing this opportunity. And welcome to all for this webinar that focuses on a very large and undoubtedly very unique region, and also which represents the most populated region in the world and also the most densely populated. So there are various qualifiers I am adding, but our webinar is taking place at a time when the world is collectively combating the COVID-19 pandemic. Devastating impacts of the virus on a global scale remind us of our vulnerabilities, of our interdependence, underscoring the importance of collective actions and the need for international cooperation in the face of complex and interconnected global risks. I understand that we have today a very large international audience representing several countries and institutions, and I take this opportunity to welcome them all. Undoubtedly, the South and Southeast Asian region is one of the most diverse regions in the world in terms of social, cultural, biological, climatic, and geomorphological terms. So you take any attribute and you'll find that this region is very unique and diverse. It also has the highest mountains, the deepest oceans, vast alluvial plains, coastal and arid landscapes, and of course, small and large islands. If you look at the other figures, 60% of the current global population of the world, 52% of the global poor, and as much as 75% of the global population of 370 million indigenous people, they all reside in this area. So undoubtedly, it's a very, very important area. And we are also aware that throughout the human history, agriculture has played a central role in the economies of this region. Even today, 2/3 of our population still depend on agriculture for their living. At the same time, majority of the population also directly depends on biodiversity for their livelihoods. These very high population levels, they translate into increased resource demand on an already decreased biological diversity of the region. And it is my feeling that this particular situation will continue. And this region will continue to rapidly develop, fueling increased demand on natural resources and obviously threatening the biodiversity in the process. I want to draw your attention to a very recently conducted assessment report by none other than the IBIS, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which has done an assessment of the Asia-Pacific region, of which the South and Southeast Asia are an integral part. So this assessment covers the entire Asia-Pacific, but has made some very interesting conclusions. And I don't think we need to go far, but to say that this rich biodiversity and valuable ecosystem services that provide human well-being are part of this region. While the region has enjoyed rapid economic growth, rapid urbanization and agriculture expansion, this has come obviously at the expense of biodiversity. And I think that is why we are all here to discuss, to deliberate, to consider that how we can tackle the loss of biodiversity in a meaningful way. Socioeconomic and demographic changes are also major indirect drivers of the loss of biodiversity and nature's contribution to people, resulting in conversion and degradation of habitats, an increased number of invasive alien species, and rising population level. The point I'm making is that this assessment has very clearly indicated what is the state of affairs in this big region. Economic growth and infrastructure development are essential for achieving the Sustainable Development Goal, but these need to be pursued in harmony with nature. So this oft-quoted remark, living in harmony with nature, I must say that for a very large part of our region, people have lived in harmony with nature. Now the question is coming of how do we mainstream biodiversity into development policies, plans and programs so that we can achieve the ambitious Aichi targets and the Sustainable Development Goal. This assessment has given us large number of leads. It says that collaborative, participatory and decentralized governance, that includes the formal government, the local communities, the private sector, the non-governmental organization in decision making, can facilitate the sustainable use of biodiversity. However, I must stress that the prosperity of the current and future generation in this region depends upon the ability to align economic growth with conservation of Earth's ecosystem and biodiversity. We also need a stable climate. We also need sustainable management of resources, which are all the foundations of healthy and resilient economies as well as ecosystems. As I speak, I would like to stress that we need to commit to scale up our efforts in addressing the multitude of challenges at all levels and to urgently take concrete actions. And these actions have to be in line with the recommendations of science to conserve and to restore the environment and its ecosystems and services, whether they are on the land or at the sea. And also we need to protect the ocean wealth. Now all countries in the world are now trying to work back to build back better from the COVID-19 pandemic. But while doing so, we must do it through an environmentally sustainable and inclusive recovery path. Because this path has to be more inclusive, it has to be resilient, and our sustainable future must align with the recovery efforts so that we are able to carve out a win-win situation. I must also quickly dwell on the policies, the institutional frameworks, and the governance option for achieving the SDGs and the most ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework, which is under preparation, which is under development, which is under negotiation. And my colleague Basile is going to talk in a while from now that at what stage we are in and what we as a country need to do to build up this framework. Finally, I would say that this IBIS assessment that I talked about has given us some action and lead points for immediate implementation. We don't have to go far. We need to look at that. And you would recall that the IBIS system has also produced what is called as a summary for policymakers. And I'm quoting from that. It says that local communities and higher level stakeholders collaborating in the decision-making processes that involve the conservation of nature, these are the ones who are best positioned to ensure the sustainable use of biodiversity and the nature's contribution to people. My colleague Sunita is going to dwell more deeply into it, but it is very clear that mainstreaming of biodiversity into development policies, plans, and programs are needed so that we can improve and achieve the Aichi targets and the sustainable goals. A lot is being talked about the ecosystem-based approaches. We are talking of ecosystem-based adaptation, disaster risk reduction, sustainable forest and pasture management. These are the things which are needed, and all the commitments that we are making under various conventions and multilateral agreements have to adhere to this philosophy of implementing ecosystem-based approach. Finally, biodiversity-rich and threatened terrestrial, marine, and wetland ecosystem, they transcend the political boundaries. Action or inaction in any one country can generate positive or negative effects in neighboring or downstream countries. This is a big lesson that we are learning, and therefore transboundary conservation initiatives become very, very important. We cannot forget the private sector, because private sector also has an important role to play. We also need to look at the non-governmental organization, the civil society organization, because these are the agencies which can help the countries to meet the growing gaps in funding to finance the conservation efforts. Sustainable production, consumption, and waste management policies are needed to help reduce biodiversity loss. We also need to promote low carbon and renewable solutions that are less polluting and more sustainable. And finally, as I said, that this region has huge human population, and we need to work out a way in which we can make use of this human capital. Obviously, we need to put a limit on the numbers of our population growth to a desired level, but we need to work out a way in which we can use the human capital for securing and strengthening biodiversity conservation. I would stop here, and I would request my other colleagues to chip in, because this webinar today is very, very important as we move ahead in our endeavor to develop a post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And these discussions, these inputs that we are going to get from all of you, going to be very, very meaningful and important. So thank you very much. And I hand it over back to Aleksandar for further action on this webinar. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Vinod. Well, I think you set the stage and challenges very, very eloquently, and I think it's a perfect moment to switch to Basile, so that you tell us where we are in trying to address all of these challenges.
Good day to all of you. I have prepared a few slides, so I will share my screen. It's not very long, just have 9 or 10. And some of you may have already seen some of those concepts. I just try to focus on the issue at hand. So a very quick update on the process. Don't worry, this looks quite elaborate, but in fact, I'm trying to describe that what we have here is a number of IUSPs that are connecting to each other. And there is a couple of very important points. One is what is going to start very soon and will end up in the February-March timeframe, is a SBSTA and SBI process that is going to be providing us with some advice. And those advice will be focusing on one side on the SBSTA, on numerical values, on indicators, on baseline information, and then that together with the thematic consultation on sustainable use, on synergies, on ABS, and those are all themes that Dr. Matura talked in his address earlier, as well as the implementation, resource mobilization, capacity building. And that is going to converge with the preparation of draft 1, the third meeting of the open-ended working group, and eventually the COP in 2021. Now, moving into how the framework is shaped, and you've seen various iteration of that change theory of change. And this is one that should be read from the right to the left, starting with the vision, living in harmony with nature. You've told us to articulate the goals around 4 of them: ecosystem, species, genetics, human needs, benefit sharing, and means of implementation. And then to enable those changes and to reach that status we're looking for, then there is a number of action. And we've grouped them into 3 categories. The one that are directly addressing the threats to biodiversity, the one that is enabling needy people needs. And where one of the key characteristics of what we're trying to do is balancing the 3 objectives of the convention. And in order to do that, there is a number of tools and solutions, as well as means of implementation, enabling condition, responsibility, and transparency. So if we blow this up and get into a little bit more detail, I've talked about the vision, I've talked about the goals. What you see behind each of the goals is short-term milestone, short-term in the context of a 10-year milestone, with some, we propose some relatively clear numerical targets to be reached. And then you see there behind the 7 targets related to threats, and you've seen that many times. I'll get into the detail into the following slide, meeting people needs and the tools and solution. In terms of the reducing the threats, you've seen there the first 2 ones are related to how we manage and protect and conserve land with this notion of planning, land use planning, retaining and restoring upfront, and then also conservation and protection with the proposed targets of 30 by 30 that you must have heard about. Species recovery, which contain the various elements of recovery not talked about above, making sure that harvest, trade, and use is sustainable, invasive alien species. And then we get to pollution, and you see here the 3 priority substances, among others, nutrients, biocides, and plastic. And it's interesting to note that the overlap between climate and nature starts there. Everybody talked about nature-based solution that is in target 1 and 2, about how land conservation is useful for climate, but also is excess nutrients, so is better agriculture. And then climate change, so definitively we're talking about both mitigation, adaptation, risk reduction, and nature-based solution. And moving on to people needs, so we try to refine and better organize, and I see the discussion room were very useful for that. There is the target around the use of species with a focus on fisheries, and talking about the food security, livelihood, and health, with a focus on the poor. Particularly, I make a lot of links to the points made by Dr. Matura a little bit earlier. The use of space with a focus on agriculture, forestry, and aquaculture. And this is around the management of ecosystem. Other regulating service, so we went back to the IPBES analysis and the 14 regulating service, so here you catch everything. Obviously, number 11 on health and culture and access to green and blue space, particularly focusing on urban dwellers. This is a very long slide with a number of enabling targets up top, as it should be, mainstreaming, divided in 2 between what is focused on policy planning and government at all levels. The second one more focused on the private sector. Number 15 is around these indirect drivers and the change in society. And that's a major, major change. I think one of the challenges we're going to have is to communicate and make that change, enabling that change, because that's a changing the consumer behavior, supply chain, choice each of us make. Biosafety remain, incentive and subsidies and resource mobilization 17-19 work together. And that's part of that huge change. How we're going to be enabling that change is likely going to be under incentive and subsidies. Vidal Matura has spoke about the significant effort that is needed on the subsidies and repurposing, and the significant investment that is being done in recovery. One of the big challenges we're going to be facing is the state of public finance when we get to the end of our negotiation. Let's not kid ourselves. This will be challenging, and then probably a lot of the solution will reside in incentive and subsidies. And then finally, information and the role of indigenous people, local communities, women and girls use intergenerational equity, etc. A couple of points, and I'm going to finish very soon, on supporting mechanism is the need to mobilize resource, capacity development, knowledge generation, technical and scientific cooperation. A very long list. I'll focus on a couple around governance, political will. You'll see mainstreaming and partnership. So, and finally, this notion of the right of nature. There is a very, very strong message coming to us from parties about the need for a more robust responsibility and transparency system. This is a system that should be comprehensive, starting from planning all the way to the review process. It should be an open system that integrates and connects well with other systems. So If we want a framework for all, we should have a system that is open to all and be able to account for the progress and the contribution of the many actors and do that in a more organized way. And obviously, it should be connected to others. So this completes my presentation. Aleksandar, I'll give the floor back to you, and I'm looking forward to the question.
Thank you so much, Basile. Very useful indeed, and even I think for the people who may have heard some of the elements in the past few weeks, it's still important to realize both that work is still ongoing and that there are more efforts to pursue despite everything. So we have the next presentation by Dr. Teresa. Are we ready to share the screen? I think it's James who needs to share his screen. Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Teresa. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Aleksandar. And again, thank you also to Basile, who also graciously joined us during our consultation, the kickoff meeting for the ASEAN, for its ASEAN Biodiversity Conference online. Good evening from Manila. We express our sincere thanks to the IDDRI and the Canada Embassy in France for giving this opportunity for the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity to share our insights and ambitions for biodiversity for the Conference of the Parties meeting in Kunming, China in May 2021. We are happy to join you today in this relevant webinar as we prepare for the COP and take stock of the status and ways forward for biodiversity post-2020. Earlier, Vinod already mentioned about COVID-19, and this pandemic unveiled the grim consequences of tipping the delicate balance between ecosystems and anthropogenic pressure. Habitat loss due to depletion and unsustainable use of resources has driven the natural virus reservoirs closer to human populations, increasing the risk of transmissions. Achieving biodiversity targets and intensifying strategies for biodiversity conservation becomes more urgent nowadays, because this is how we will be able to harness long-term solutions. This becomes more difficult because stimulus measures this also becomes difficult for stimulus measures because that has been passed by ASEAN governments has largely focused on restoring lost livelihoods and addressing the containment of the pandemic, so the economy can be restored to pre-pandemic levels. So a lot of resources have been going to COVID-19 response for most of the ASEAN countries. The deadline for achieving global biodiversity targets is fast approaching. Initial reports from the 5th edition of the GBO, launched last week, presented a dismal picture where the world at large collectively failed to fulfill most, if not all, of the Aichi biodiversity targets. Although there were efforts intensively undertaken by all parties, these were not enough to bend the curve of biodiversity loss. While it was regrettable that the 2020 global biodiversity targets will, by this time we already know that will most likely not be met, we are not discouraged. We continue to be hopeful and to exert more concerted efforts so at least close the gap in the remaining months before COP15. Like most CBD parties, the ASEAN region has done a lot in fulfilling Aichi biodiversity targets, specifically Target 11. The ASEAN region has contributed 13.25% out of the 17% target of terrestrial area coverage, while marine protected areas in the region are now at 3.43% out of the 10% global target. As of June 2020, the global coverage is estimated at 15% for terrestrial areas and 7% for marine areas. Given the remaining months towards the next COP, the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity is working with the CBD Secretariat as the regional implementation support network node for Aichi Target 11 to continue to find ways to fulfill the quantitative and qualitative targets of Aichi Target 11. The ACB supported a series of virtual meetings on Aichi Target implementation in the ASEAN region. The first session last September 10 served as an initial dialogue among the ASEAN member states. The ACB and indigenous peoples and local community support groups from Southeast Asia discussed on how other area-based conservation measures, including indigenous community conserved areas, may be able to contribute to augment the quantitative area coverage for Aichi Target 11. Last 23 of September, the ASEAN, as I mentioned earlier, held the third ASEAN Conference on Biodiversity kickoff event, where the discussion focused on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. It was a very opportune activity coming just 5 days after the CBD's joint virtual session on SABSA 24 and SBI 3, where there were similar discussions on the framework last September 18. During the virtual dialogue, the AMS presented views on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, focusing in particular on mainstreaming, resource mobilization, as well as the need for flexibility in the indicators to accommodate the level of capacity of countries that will need to step up its efforts in implementing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The successful conduct of COP15 and the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework are in the interest of the ASEAN region. It is expected that the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework will be able to help the region achieve the common objectives of halting biodiversity loss and putting biodiversity on the path to recovery. Based on initial discussions that we have organized together with the CBD Secretariat and the OEWG co-chairs prior to the start of the discussions in OEWG1 in August, the ASEAN member states' perspective on the framework were largely organized into 4 themes, namely resource mobilization, mainstreaming biodiversity, communication, and integrating diverse perspectives. One of the elements of the draft post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, the GBF, that is considered crucial and of particular interest to the ASEAN is resource mobilization. As far back as COP12, 13, and 14, the ASEAN at the highest political level have consistently called for adequate resources to support and complement the implementation of national level and region-wide activities that contribute to meeting global biodiversity targets and commitments. This was reiterated by the AMS at the OEWG workshop that was organized in 2019, and they underlined the point that mobilizing resources for biodiversity is pivotal in the success of the framework's implementation. During the virtual dialogue, 2 days past, some member states expressed concerns that responses to COVID-19 may pose difficulties in mobilizing additional resources to meet the targets under the post-2020 GBF and implement the respective national biodiversity strategies and action plans. The pandemic also increases pressures on ecosystems and likelihood of overexploitation and rampant illegal wildlife trade. These concerns are valid as the pandemic has adversely affected economies globally. But of course, I would like to repeat what Basile mentioned during the dialogue. He said nations must consider investments for biodiversity as investments for their prosperity. So reversing biodiversity loss can also provide economic benefits to the ASEAN region and the rest of the world. Indeed, as economic development largely depends on biodiversity and natural resources, giving due consideration to biodiversity conservation can help address climate change and puts nations on the path to recovery post-COVID-19. The ACB supports the AMS as they undertake concrete efforts to mobilize resources for biodiversity conservation and management with the support of dialogue and development partners. So let me stress that the efforts of mainstreaming and resource mobilization are interlinked as we strive to harness multi-stakeholder synergies for efficient, cohesive, and responsive pooling and use of resources. So as I mentioned, it's important, mainstreaming can also contribute to resource mobilization. So the importance of mainstreaming biodiversity has always been underscored in the region, as expressed by the ASEAN leaders in a joint statement to CBD COP15. And I quote, and that's in front of your screen, to accelerate actions corresponding to the challenges to mainstream biodiversity considerations into relevant national plans and sectors, such as in agriculture, fisheries, tourism, health, mining, energy, infrastructure, manufacturing, and processing, and education. And in cross-sectoral issues, such as climate change, and call upon parties to the CBD and other governments and organizations to share their experiences and practices to mainstream biodiversity. So mainstreaming biodiversity in the health sector is becoming crucial at this point, as we heed the call for strengthening the regional response against the COVID-19 pandemic. Recently, in the recent ASEAN Leaders Summit, it was recognized that biodiversity conservation is one of the cross-cutting issues that needs to be advanced for sustainable development. We reaffirmed the importance of advancing cooperation on environmental protection and conservation with greater efforts to address cross-cutting issues, and among them was mentioned biodiversity conservation. From COP13 and COP14 decisions and from previous consultations, the ASEAN member states have identified sectors aside from health, agriculture, education, tourism, infrastructure and finance, and banking as priorities for mainstreaming biodiversity. So through its sustained engagement, of the AMS, intersectoral collaboration to raise awareness, influence policy actions, and foster cooperation towards biodiversity conservation is being done through our mainstreaming agenda. For mainstreaming to commence, so I've already mentioned resource mobilization, mainstreaming has figured as important elements for the ASEAN member states. And then communication. For mainstreaming to commence, it is important that a common understanding of the urgency to take immediate and long-term actions on mainstreaming biodiversity into all development sectors be developed. This will be done by effectively raising awareness on the science and rationale of biodiversity conservation and enabling and sustaining dialogue among parties and stakeholders. The ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community Blueprint of 2025, or the ASCC Blueprint 2025, recommends that there must be a coherent, comprehensive, and innovative communication and education strategy, and to maximize information and communication technologies to get our messages across different sectors. It is also crucial to establish mechanisms to communicate targets and strategies under the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework with state and non-state actors. Targets and strategies must be simple and easily understood. The AMS called for a better and timely monitoring of progress of the implementation of the post-2020 GBF. Nations must agree to common quantitative indicators that can easily be communicated, similar to the City Biodiversity Index or the Singapore Index, which measures and evaluates biodiversity conservation efforts. These have also been pointed out by ASEAN member states during the virtual dialogue with the CBD. The fourth focus area identified by the ASEAN member states is integrating diverse perspectives. This is necessary, particularly important in particularly in the ASEAN, which apart from its rich biodiversity also has diverse cultures and socioeconomic and political backgrounds. The implementation of the framework and the realization of our goals require integrating diverse perspectives, which also necessitates a whole of society approach. The diversity of perspectives, culture, and backgrounds should not deter us from collective actions, however, towards achieving our biodiversity goals. Coming from the same region, we are often similarly situated, frequently sharing the same successes, challenges, opportunities, and ultimately the same vision for our biodiversity. Hence, synergies among states and across sectors are crucial. The ASEAN region is highly vulnerable to climate change and has also been severely affected by COVID-19 pandemic as well. The health, ecological, and socioeconomic impacts of this crisis are far-reaching, and we will need to come up with sustainable and appropriate responses. Our solutions lie in nature. Not only will the conservation of habitats and ecosystems help prevent future pandemics, but it will also offer hope for cure or treatment for various diseases. And that's something that we share with India. Regional and sub-regional cooperation, of course, is placed at a premium as we work towards achieving biodiversity targets and in embedding nature-based solutions into climate action and disaster mitigation and response. These synergies would foster inclusiveness and allow greater engagement among countries in ways that are more responsive to their goals, needs, resources, and capacities. By building on and further strengthening regional and sub-regional cooperation and South-South cooperation, we can call for higher levels of resource mobilization to support various initiatives and programs for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Through comprehensive and systematic mechanisms to mobilize resources and dynamic regional and sub-regional cooperation, implementation of NBSAPs could be scaled up and available resources can be maximized and complemented among stakeholders. The ASEAN is looking forward to post-2020 to further enhance the benefit that its people can derive from its rich biodiversity. And to quote ASEAN Secretary General Dato Lim Jock Hoi during the 15th ASEAN Ministerial Meeting on Environment just last year, the region's biodiversity and ecosystems are essential to the economic, social, and environmental well-being of the ASEAN people. Once again, thank you very much for this opportunity and good evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Teresa. Thank you for providing us with, again, an overview of the many things that have been going on in the ASEAN region and all the mobilization that is still ongoing. And so Sunita, are you ready?
Yes.
Yes,
let's just sharing my screen.
Yeah, wonderful. There are questions arriving in the Q&A box. Please keep sending them as we will have time to address them after that. Sunita, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
What a beautiful first slide already.
Thank you, Aleksandar. Okay, so I was just going to ask you if you can see my slide. Yes, you can. Thank you. So good day, everyone. In a few slides, I'd like to walk you through the India story, looking at what we have here and how we relate to the challenges right now that we are facing all together, but also looking forward with what the GBF has put in place. So very quickly, a chronology of our policies, of the biodiversity policy of India. And the biodiversity policy in India is very, very highly aligned with the CBD mandate. So it pretty much follows all the three objectives of the CBD, and it more or less mirrors the language of the CBD. There is an act and there are rules associated with the act. It's called the Biological Diversity Act of India, that was adopted in 2002. As I said, it echoes the CBD Convention text. What is unique about this act was it was developed in a very inclusive and participatory manner. There were several consultations that were held across multiple stakeholder groups, and so it reflects the priorities and values of multiple stakeholder groups. So it's very high on issues of equity. It places a lot of emphasis on plural values of biodiversity. It's highly acknowledged. So it goes all the way from the private sector, so values relating to commercialization, to sustainable use, to traditional use, to conventional use. So all of that is covered in the Act. So the Biological Diversity Act is pretty much also the ABS Act, we could say, of India, but it provides very clear exceptions for traditional use and traditional users, acknowledging the nuance that is required and the special circumstances that have to be considered when local communities are involved in the use of resources. It also places a high value. It also gives exceptions to resources that are normally traded. So those that are already in the market as commodities don't come under the purview of the Act. It also provides exceptions to non-commercial research collaborations. So if that becomes commercial, then change of intent requires ABS, is the trigger for ABS agreements, but otherwise non-commercial research has to be promoted. So it is trying to be very facilitative of biodiversity, of biological resource-based research and development, while at the same time also having a regulatory function. It is a highly challenging task, as Dr. Vinod will attest to, being both a facilitator and a regulator, but that's how the Act stands. The other unique aspect of the biodiversity policy in India is that decision-making goes through a three-tiered approach. So there are statutory bodies that are there at the local level of implementation. Then there is a body that is there at the provincial level, which is the federal level. So I mean at the state level we call them. So at the level of provinces there is a body, and then the apex body, which is the National Biodiversity Authority. So at the level of local communities, the body which is called the Biodiversity Management Committee is mandated to regulate access to resources. It has got the mandate to also to charge levies or fees as it may deem appropriate towards access, and also determine appropriate benefit sharing norms, mechanisms at that level. And of course, there can be a consultative process between different bodies and with experts. But that level of decentralization is built into the Act. These bodies also have a say in ensuring sustainable utilization by various user groups. The third aspect, which is quite unique in India, is that there's a high degree of harmonization that we can already see between various related policies. So, for instance, the Patent Act and the Biodiversity Act are already harmonized. So anyone who wants to, for instance, get a patent on a product that uses a biological resource, will have to get the permission from the Biodiversity Authority that they have complied with the prior informed consent and the issue of geographical origin already, and then make their submission to the patent body, patent authorization body, if they desire to get a patent. If they do not do that, it will come back to the NBA for approval again. So this has been built into as an amendment to the Patent Act. So this level of harmonization, we can also see, for instance, in other environment acts, which is a bit more natural to see, but in the Trade and Commerce Act acts also we find quite a bit of harmonization. India also has a policy where the corporate on corporate social responsibility, where it is mandated that 2% of profits will have to be set aside for some form of social responsibility, and there is quite a persuasion that goes on by various user groups, getting the private sector that utilizes biological resources to put their money into the source of their income. So basically put their money for conservation and various livelihood improvement programs so that their supply linkages are actually strengthened. So the Act and rules themselves are more or less like the Holy Grail. And so it's very hard to touch them and make amendments to the Act. So but given that since 2002 to now, there have been so many developments in international policy in the various discussions related to governance of commons, to governance of biological resources, or to the debates surrounding ABS and all of that. These advances have to be made equivalently at the national level, and the way that is being dealt with right now is by issuing guidelines to the Act and thereby get into implementation. So that's the background of how the apparatus works in India. But in the context of, therefore, the global biodiversity framework and COVID, but before we get to COVID, just within the context of GBF, so India, I mean, historically, we've been a big supporter of the objectives of CBD, but also very strong support of the vision, goals, and targets of the GBF. But given COVID, the background, the scenario of COVID, there's a lot more of an acknowledgement that we have to look at forming synergies between various related sectors, and those sectors are the environment, health sector, and also the animal husbandry or the livestock sector. So it's more the One Health approach, we could call it, and that's something that as Dr. Vinod mentioned at the beginning, the civil society organizations, for instance, in India, they're a very strong pillar for that, who enable implementation of several of these policies, and they come from the development angle of things. There's a lot that they're also doing for conservation, but it's always linked with development. And this One Health approach, without being labeled as a One Health approach, there are several initiatives in India where ethno-veterinary practices have been linked with conservation of medicinal plants and linked with livelihood improvement programs. And there are several such projects that are out there, not upscaled yet, but there's a lot of experience on the ground, and they've been supported by the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change over several decades, actually. So there's quite a bit of experience there. But now with COVID, this has, in a way, it has all come together. It's all converged together, the idea, and to see that, okay, we should probably be investing more resources in One Health type of approaches is being acknowledged. But we don't see this so much as direct language in the GBF right now. Actually, in the GBF, health and well-being is, I mean, it's there, but it's not fully there. And that's something that maybe we could work on as a language that I think the negotiators might be keen to see, to mainstream and strengthen that language quite a bit more. Mainstreaming, again, going back to what Dr. Teresa Lim was also speaking about, in the COVID context, it just cannot be stated even more emphatically. You know, we see that that is so key, that mainstreaming biodiversity across various related sectors is just absolutely essential, especially to capitalize on concepts of risk preparedness, to ensure local employment, and also this makes it much more easier. In a way, this whole pandemic, this whole crisis has made it easier to communicate the importance of biodiversity across various interest groups, related sectors, that they should actually come together now, pool their resources and synergize efforts. And some of the major big ticket sectors, actually echoing what Dr. Lim just now mentioned, would be food and agriculture, health, development, cross-sectoral issues like climate action, and of course, looking at the broader economic stimulus packages. However, is it possible? We will need to ensure that biodiversity features in all of this. And the term that when I had a discussion with Dr. Vinod, was the term that's being used in circulation in India is biodiversity proofing policies of the future, that we ensure that it is right there in the center. There's also quite a bit of emphasis because that it's not just the big players in the private sector who will be responsible, who will be held responsible for this. It is important, but dependence on biological resources for various businesses is much more higher at the local scale, at the small and medium scale, and therefore there's a lot more of emphasis that's being seen in promoting small and medium enterprises and rural employment programs in a much more sustainable fashion, in a more inclusive and participatory fashion. So again, the buzzwords being that we have to get into a convergence mode, we have to ensure more coordination between various sectors, various stakeholder groups, and planning departments. But then again, zooming out some more, we look at the broader picture at stake, and we're all aware that the economies, most national economies are in quite a mess. So the GDP and the state of the economy has been really badly affected. It's seen close to 7 months of lockdown. People haven't been working, and getting the economy restarted is the priority now. It's not just priority, it's urgent priority. So the impetus certainly is to move quickly to start the economy, to enable trade, whether it's domestic trade or whether it's international trade, and we need to quickly bounce back. Even with some time lags, this is the stated intent, and this is where we have to go. So there's this realization that we need to live with the virus, that we can't just be sitting ducks, and we have to get more proactive and be more careful about how with appropriate COVID protective measures. There's a big focus in this push for the growth of the economy. There's a big focus on ensuring self-reliance within the self-reliance in the economy. So there's a big push to ensure that there is more domestic manufacturing, that the domestic industry is revitalized, and that revival is prioritized, especially at the industrial scale. But again, the specter of COVID is still very large. And it's also very true that we live in a highly telecoupled world. And that's what the IBES assessments have been showing, that what actions we make here today are not just going to stay as impacts over here. It will have impacts in many other regions of the world elsewhere. And conversely, it's going to be the same. Actions taken elsewhere will have impacts on us. And this, I think, harks back to the point that both Dr. Lim and Dr. Vinod made at the beginning, that there is more need for cooperation between countries, that we should ensure more transboundary cooperation, more South-South cooperation, and various other forms of collaborations we should think of, so that we all get out of this competitive mode and get into a more collaborative effort, because it's all our lives and our well-being that is at stake. So there is a need, we very clearly, there is an acknowledgement that we need to coexist with whatever we are seeing as a crisis here. But at the same time, we need to ensure livelihoods. We need to ensure that basic needs such as food, health, and these are very vital issues for a large percentage of the population in India, that basic needs such as food, health, income, access to clean air, water, ecosystem services, all that's covered actually in the GBF, the lists that Basile presented, that all of these are ensured. They are rights, they are basic rights that people have a right to all of these. And that they're ensured in both the rural areas and in the urban areas. So we need to ensure that there is equity in the distribution of these various facilities. But to do this, it's important that we don't again go back to the piecemeal approach we had, that we just say, okay, we ensure food security, but then it might have an impact on the landscape itself, on the integrity of the ecosystem, because we're just going in for some intensive agriculture practices that have a deleterious effect. So it needs a more systemic socio-ecological approach. The ecosystem-based approach is one of them. We have the more popular and more intuitive concept of landscape approaches, which is like an umbrella term, which captures the human nature interactions, that we see that what happened, the actions within the social systems have impacts on the natural system, and vice versa too. And we see in India there is some movement, at least at the ground level, to recognize this, that people are trying to put in place more sustainable pathways, because well-being is being hurt in a big way. There are more, vulnerabilities are quickly becoming disasters very, very quickly. So, and that's not nice at all. And people want to ensure that they prove themselves from such disasters in the future. So we see that there's more receptivity to these, to having a more systemic approach to finding solutions. But really, this is all thinking that is there. There is implementation, but it's still a bit episodic. So that we have anecdotes. We still have to see a much more matured policy that brings all of this together and gets implemented. And as I said, there are urgencies and priorities that are taking up the headspace of the planners, and we hope. So it's really, how will the trade-offs between these economic and environmental concerns be managed is something that we will have to wait and watch. We hope it will be done in a systemic fashion, but that's something that we will have to wait and watch. I think I'll stop there for now, and we can take more during the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sunita. Thank you, everybody. I find it striking to see how many points resonate between actually all of the presentations and even the introduction, and also how they resonate with a lot of points that we heard in the previous webinar with the African group of negotiators, but also what we hear in discussions here in Europe, and I guess also Basile is familiar to what you can hear in Canada. So I think we globally face a lot of similar challenges when it comes to especially the place of these issues in the recovery. And as you mentioned, the need for biodiversity safe proofing, is that? No, proofing, biodiversity proofing everything. So we have about an hour now of time for discussion between the panelists and for Q&A with the audience. If I may ask Dr. Vinod, maybe to start the series of questions or reactions to what we just heard, and maybe we can do that for maybe a series of 2 or 3 questions, and then open up the floor to the audience. So go ahead if you want to start, Dr. Vinod.
Yeah, thank you, Aleksandar. I think we have listened in the last 30 to 40 minutes, 3 very interesting presentations. But I would now try to focus on the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, for the simple reason that we have one of the 2 chief architects in Brazil with us. And see, as countries are struggling to work on the post-2020 framework, I narrate 2 situations. One was when we started talking about the framework. At that point of time, there was no COVID. So the initial few months of discussion took place as if there was no COVID, and there was no COVID. And all countries were progressing and thinking that here is our opportunity to make this framework very ambitious. Now, in the past 6 to 8 months, when the entire world is grappling with COVID-19 and budgets are being shrunk and all kinds of economic packages are being talked about, I would like to hear from Basile that what could be his perspective on continuing to be more ambitious, or now to be a more pragmatic because of the COVID considerations. So an advice from him would be very helpful for countries which are trying to negotiate, trying to work out position. So Basile, I would request you to kindly elaborate this as we go along.
Thank you, Vinod. That's a big question, and there is basically 2 parts to that question. On one hand, I think we have to understand and realize that a capacity of countries to engage into negotiation has been severely impacted in many, many cases by COVID. So there is absolutely no question when, even, in all countries, it's not just a developing countries, smaller island states, developed country, like my country in Canada. I was talking with the team in charge of the protected area, and in my country, a big part of the solution is engaging with indigenous people, because they are the ones that are the stewards of the land. Well, today, those people are busy with the health and livelihood of their people. There is simply no capacities available to engage into discussion about protected area, and that is a very sound decision. There is no amount of money that can solve that. If a limited number of people are trained and capable, and those people are busy with life and death issues, they're not going to deal with the conservation. So I can only imagine the challenge in smaller countries and countries with limited capacity. So we have to adapt to that, and we can adapt to that. The second side of the equation is the COVID situation has made everybody realize that one part of the health solution is better management of our landscape and better management of our nature. So on this side, the need is there, the need to act is now. So basically, we need to find ways by which we enable parties' participation into the negotiation, and we do not slow down. We do not put on pause the negotiation, because we need a healthy ecosystem to protect ourselves for the next pandemic. So it's a big challenge. It is one where we need to put extra efforts, but I am confident. A little bit extra time is not a bad thing. It will make for a better framework. We are thinking about all kind of new ways to engage into conversation. Last week, there was 2,000 people that listened to our presentation on the updated framework. I was talking with Francis Ogwal, my colleague from Uganda, and he was mentioning that he could engage 8 or 10 people from his staff in listening to that. So it was not just the 1 or 2 that would travel to the meeting and come back and debrief. It was 5 times more that was able to engage. So let's keep in mind the opportunity as well as the challenge that this is bringing to us. Thank you, Vinod.
Thank you, Basile, for that explanation. I would now like to move to Teresa, and I'll first explain the dilemma. See, although COVID-19 has one of the most reasons we have not taken care of our environment. We have not taken care of our natural heritage. We have not taken care of our forest. And because of that, we have now reached a situation where the COVID effects have been amplified or multiplied. Now, having said that, countries are now talking of economic packages. And when we are talking of economic packages, there is the fear that again, the environment may take a backseat. Now, if for recovering from effects which we ourselves caused, the cure itself is also causing more problem, then what is our action which is going to be? So on the face, it appears to be a complicated question, but you have been a practitioner all along. I would like to hear from you, or our audience would like to hear from you, that what do we mean when we say that environment and ecology needs to be built into the recovery package? How it is going to actually happen? Can we give some examples of it? So over to you, Teresa.
Thank you, Vinod, for the question. From what we have done, actually, as Basile mentioned, we're looking at the situation also as an opportunity to communicate the importance of protecting biodiversity and environment, and sharing the science that is available, that provides that link between what's happening to us now and the damage that has been done to our environment and biodiversity. We have, one of the initiatives that we undertook was to do a survey of the ASEAN heritage parks in the region. And the ASEAN heritage parks are the protected areas that are of regional importance. And in the survey, we assessed the impacts of COVID in those areas. And indeed, we have been able to see that, well, the results of the survey showed that you know, the limitations in mobility, some of the resources were of course used for more for support for daily needs. And but then they also realized that you know, they were the importance of protecting the ecosystems, because most of these ASEAN heritage parks were also ecotourism areas, and they were much affected by COVID, the loss of tourism revenues. And so because of that impact, they now realize how important it is to, and then the link of you know, if we explain further that some of these ASEAN heritage parks are also habitat areas for implicated natural reservoirs of diseases. And so we are able to engage more with the communities. And the park rangers who were not able to reach the AHPs because of mobility problems, it was the local communities and the indigenous peoples who live around and within these areas that were able to support, to help in the protection of the ASEAN heritage parks. And so these are practical examples where we try to point out some of the relevance of protecting the biodiversity through the actions through the survey, the results of the ASEAN Heritage Park survey that we did, relating it with how it was managed under the circumstances with the presence of COVID-19. So yeah, so we take all of these things and we try to communicate them as well to higher decision makers and to our focal points. This is something that we are, we need to highlight in some of our communication packages as well. So we're really, we're really looking at these experiences, practical experiences, as a means to communicate the importance of protecting biodiversity. And it's not too late. So I think we're getting more attention as well. At this point, there are different, as Basile also pointed out, there are different ways of communicating now. We're lucky to have online platforms to be able to do this as well. So we're probably reaching out to more people this way, and yeah, so that's how we are managing it at this point.
Thank you, Teresa. I think I will now go back to Sunita. And Sunita, you very clearly mentioned that how the One Health approach is now being talked about. This COVID-19 has made all of us realize that you can't take human health, animal health, environmental health separately. But the question is, at what level should the effort start? See, should we have a national program which deals with One Health, or it could be at other levels? And in your context, you have been dealing with communities for a very long time. And communities have their own way. See, right now for others, it might be a new thing and we are talking in terms of One Health. But the communities since long know that these are interlinked with each other. So what examples you would give by which we can learn from these communities that this is how the One Health can be practiced in a much more efficient manner to start with?
Okay. So one part of your question was which scale we should start, right? So I do think that in India, we've already shown, like through the Biodiversity Act, for instance, the architecture of that, the implementation architecture of that the three-tiered approach really works because of the diversity of this country, for example. For instance, the context can be so different. The cultural context itself can be so different. So decisions need to be taken at the local level, but guidance needs to come from above that. And there definitely needs to be a national mission that would coordinate all of this, because otherwise things can go all over the place. So I really believe that having a decentralized approach, but at the same time, that is all connected through this link would really be helpful. Now, coming to some examples, actually there's an example of a South-South collaboration, a North-South-South collaboration that I would like to highlight for One Health. So there is this initiative called the Natural Livestock Farming Initiative. And this is based in the Netherlands. But what they did was, so in the Netherlands, so it's big on dairy production, right, in the Netherlands, and they wanted to ensure that they reduce the antibiotic usage in livestock. But for that, they wanted to find alternatives, and they were working through NGOs. This is a civil society-led initiative, but funded by the state, by the government of Netherlands. They got some funds to initiate this. So what they did was they got in touch with, because they, as network partners, they knew of ethno-veterinarians and veterinarians in India, and in some countries in Africa. So especially in Ethiopia, and I think Ghana too. But what they did was, so there is the user group in the Netherlands, and there are veterinarians in Netherlands who are interested to experiment with new ideas okay, so it's old ideas, but in a new form, right? And what they did was to bring in expertise, including veterinary specialists and ethno-veterinarians from India and from Africa. And they would sit together and actually design interventions that were using natural resources, but they insisted it had to be sustainably sourced, and that was developed into products, so and provided to the livestock. So this is a partnership that is ongoing, and they've seen a lot more of activities built around this basic theme that they had, that they wanted to address. But at that time, so it's antibiotic use reduction, but it was for human health, right? Because you don't want to drink milk tainted with antibiotics. But it was also ensuring health of the animals. And at the same time, they wanted to ensure that it was the feed that was being provided, the medicine that was provided to them came from sustainable sources. So all of this was linked, and it is in practice a One Health approach. But that is, I mean, of course, once One Health came so big on the global scene, now they call it One Health and all of that. But otherwise, it was just a practitioner-led, it was a demand-led initiative. Which involved a lot good experts. So the supply, what the resources required was both the knowledge and the resources that can be sourced from different places. So that's an example that I can say that truly works. But within for instance, India itself, there are several such examples where people have tried, because in India there is also there's also an innovation that was brought into the Companies Act, where a producer company could be set up. So this basically functions like a cooperative, but it can function like a business house. So there would be no government intervention, and membership is only restricted to producers, that is primary producers. So it could be either farmers or it could be livestock keepers, but anybody who's engaged in primary production could come together and form a company, and it was called a producer company. So this actually brought, so there was a similar instance where in Karnataka, there was a group that a dairy union was consulting, because they wanted to reduce antibiotic usage again. And they said, can you come and work with us to develop ethno-veterinary products? So Bayer was a group, and then they actually developed some products that had a longer shelf life. So it was based on traditional resources, but it was developed in a form that was different from the traditional form of packaging and all of that, because it had to have a longer shelf life. So something like that was developed in the process. So there are some examples, quite a few examples like that, where they've tried to bring all the three together in that setup. But it's still civil society led broadly. Although One Health is now being promoted more as a top-down planning process, in practice, there's a lot of examples that we see which actually goes bottom-up.
Thank you, Sunita, for sharing those excellent insights of the community-led initiatives. See, this is very true for South and Southeast Asia, where traditional communities have been long practicing. So when we say that CBD says living in harmony with nature, our communities, our people are doing it for years now. And here is another example or string of examples you gave. But yes, there is a need for developing a formal character of the One Health program so that everybody gets and we can upscale it, and the communities themselves can learn from each other once we convert it into a program. Now, before I hand over to Aleksandar, I'll ask one question again to Basile. Basile, you have been conducting these negotiation meetings and in different parts of the world. And here is our turn from South and Southeast Asia. What do you think makes us a little different in the context of GBF? Or surely the North American needs or the Latin American needs would be different. But what would you like to give one message to our people that what we need to look forward as we try to work on the framework?
That's you know, I get 100 pairs of ears listening to what the non-Southeast Asian will say about the region. I think your region is unique. You get that mix of a very urban setting as well as rural one, a deep knowledge and attachment to nature in a very different culture, and I think you can bring to the international dialogue a very different perspective and a perspective that is needed. So it is in my mind, I would say, and I'll turn your question a little bit around, and I'm going to say what I would like the region to do is speak up more often and make your presence and your vision more visible, and make your point of view clearer in the international debate. I think we've seen a very, very organized, elaborated, sophisticated presence from the African region, and they've done that with very limited resources. And I think it's going to make for a better framework, a stronger Southeast Asia presence that bringing together of that development and Vinod, you've been talking about the need for socioeconomic development and the aspiration of people, and that's a very important perspective, and that's a perspective that we loved and dearly our colleagues in Europe and in the Western world. Sometimes they forget about that. They forget that there is other ways and other views. So please speak up. Teresa has been organizing with our organization, wonderful thing. Sunita has been involved in regional consultation. You, Vinod, you're a member of the bureau, so I defer to you, of course. And I think we need that. And then we're gonna need, the other thing is we're gonna need a lot of passions and trust. We're gonna be charting our course in new territories. We'll do our best. We'll work very close with the Bureau and with the Secretariat, but please be patient with us. I can guarantee you that there will be some hiccups and mistakes along the way, and we're gonna have to adapt and meander through that very difficult path in front of us. But we need you, and we need that unique perspective and don't be shy. That I think that I would particularly put an emphasis on the culture and the people. That's one thing that the region can bring, and that is a unique perspective. So now you have to tell us whether you think this is an accurate depiction of the unique characteristic of the region. Thank you.
Thank you. I hand it over to Aleksandar now. Please continue if you have more questions, yes, and we can open up for Q&A then.
Exactly. Thank you. I have one last question I would like to, it's a bit of a thought and a question. And yes, indeed, before we switch to answering the questions from the audience, I think that we heard that here, and we hear in different conversation that there's a huge progress that is needed to better reflect both biodiversity and climate actually in recovery plans in all regions of the world. And we hear very similar things coming from everywhere. And so I was wondering when I was listening to you, how do you think that we could coordinate all of these perspectives? Because we face very, I think, similar challenges, and how we could coordinate better this conversation between regions to look for solutions and best practices. And I was wondering whether, for example, if we could ask or think that the CBD and the UNFCCC could take the lead with maybe other international institutions, take the lead and try to organize, steer a series of works and dialogues in the coming months to try and make these perspectives converge, and so that we have a better understanding of both, I would say, the global nature of this challenge, but also find better prospects for exchanges and cooperation between regions that face very similar challenges. So do you think we could imagine something like that, and do you think it would be useful from your own perspective?
Who should start? Maybe I'll start. Aleksandar, you've touched on a very important subject, and one that I think an increasing number of people are integrating and realizing is that at the end of the day, when the implementation comes at the national and the subnational level, there is one set of people and one set of projects. Those projects may have benefit for climate, they may have benefit for biodiversity, they may have benefit for both. But there is unintegrated, and the success will be an integrated implementation plans. And that means that we're going to need increasingly to work together. And I think, and my hope, and I'm now speaking as just an individual, is that the package, the GBF, together with the decision and the COP, will clearly identify the road forward in the integration. For example, I can imagine the two sub-staff of the two COP working together on common solution. At the national level, I was amazed the other day when I discovered that my colleagues working on climate change were working on reducing the use of fertilizer, which is exactly the same issue that we're having on the biodiversity side. So it is about working together. So I sincerely hope, and that's something that eventually when I'm done with this project, I hope I'll get a chance to work on, is that interface and integration in the implementation. I think the convention themselves and the setting objective is well set up as separate, but the integration of the financing, the resource, the project design needs to happen, and needs to happen first on the ground. Over to my colleagues.
Yeah, so Aleksandar?
Yes, we hear you.
Yeah. Okay. So, I'll speak about the Philippines first because before I moved to the ASEAN, I was head of the Biodiversity Management Bureau. And we work closely with the climate sector in the National Adaptation Plan for the Philippines. And a chapter in that National Adaptation Plan already includes biodiversity, but the entry point is ecosystem-based adaptation. Now in ASEAN, we have organized some meetings with the member states because we have a different, there's a working group for biodiversity, and there's also a working group for climate change. And we've provided some opportunities for these working groups to work together and to discuss common interest. And I think this is a very good timing now, because in the ASEAN, there's a push for cross-sectoral, cross-pillar collaboration. And as and just before our webinar, there was also a climate meeting in ASEAN, and we recognize that a lot of the NDCs of the National Determined Contribution to under the UNFCCC had mention of biodiversity and ecosystems, and nature-based solutions are now the entry points for biodiversity to integrate, to have an integration between biodiversity and climate change action. So I think there's a process that's ongoing. Of course, it's a little more manageable to do it at the sub-regional level when we see similarly situated countries having this common common situation, common priorities, and seeing that biodiversity can actually contribute to climate action. So that's important. Now, if we have the opportunity to work across other regions as well, that would be much appreciated, and that is something that we also welcome. If it's we've had some discussions already with some regional groups as well in South America, and of course there's also some discussions with India as well. And I think all of this, if we have these discussions snowballing, eventually it could contribute to the global discussion. So it's not just from global down to the sub-regional and national, but it can also be an initiative at the national, and then toward and then at the regional and then global level.
Thank you. Sunita, Vinod, any remark on this?
No, so I think I mentioned that even while presenting that getting into that right now we really need to look at convergences, that identifying synergies in implementation, in resource mobilization, and building capacities, all of this is definitely going to be very, very crucial if you want to make if you want to achieve all these various goals that we have, if you want to actually head towards living in harmony with nature as a goal, in an effective manner, it's important that we realize that these connections are so entrenched, and so having a systemic approach. I mean, it's not for lack of knowledge or science. No? We know that they are all related. We know that how this has to be done. It's a whole matter, and that's a point that I think Dr. Teresa was raising. The whole point is to communicate this effectively with the various stakeholders, with the policymakers, in fact, so that they would put that into action. Yeah, at the national level and at the sub-regional, if they can get into cooperation.
Great. Any additional remark before we switch to the Q&A?
I think we should switch to Q&A now, because yes, we should provide adequate time for our participants to come in. Yeah.
Well, actually, the first question is for you, Vinod. So there's a question in the chat box asking specifically about the amounts of benefit sharing, both monetary and non-monetary, that have been mobilized in India. And the question is very also precise on whether these benefits cover the operating expenses of the administration, and if India is happy with its ABS system. And the question comes from the president of the French the National Museum of Natural History in France.
So thank you so much for that. And I would answer the third part, then second, then first. See, it's very important for me to explain, and I'll be very candid in sharing what is India's experience with ABS. See, first of all, India has been always at the forefront of ensuring that access and benefit sharing protocols are adhered to in both letter and practice, and the spirit behind. Now, our experience has been mixed. When we deal with companies, I have no hesitation in saying that companies tell me that, why are you imposing another tax? So they think in that terms that this is another tax which is being imposed to a cosmetic firm or to a firm which is doing business on biological resource. Whereas we then try to explain that the spirit of the CBD and the spirit behind the access and benefit sharing is something else that we need to respect, we need to recognize, and we need to reward the conservers of our resource. So yes, I do agree there is a resistance, and that is coming up because I would again come back on the scientific community of our inability to explain that what is the intent and purpose of these ABS regulations. So a more stronger and effective communication strategy is needed, whereby we can explain to all our stakeholders. But definitely, because communities are so strongly involved in conservation, there is a feeling that they need to be rewarded and respected for the services which they are providing. Now, coming back to recovery of the administrative cost, we have a very clear-cut mechanism that 5% of the total cost which comes through ABS can be used as an administrative expense. That is for the National Biodiversity Authority, that is also for the State Biodiversity Board, because that is only, but it is limited to only 5%. Now, coming back to what is the quantum of ABS money that we have collected, I would say that it is not huge. It should have been huge, but on a limited scale, on certain species, for example, the red sanders, which is a very important timber species used for a variety of purpose, and we have been able to collect huge amount of access and benefit sharing money on that. We are now looking at other sources where certain soils are being used for pesticides or biopesticides. But what I want to say, that we have now embarked on a string of studies to do two things, or rather three things. What is the ABS potential? See, as a country, as an authority, we need to know that this is what is the ABS potential. Then we say that, okay, how much of this potential is being realized? And thirdly is, supposing we get all our money, how are we going to spend that money? See, these three are all interlinked questions, and I wish we would have addressed them earlier, but never late than ever. We are now trying to mount up specific studies in different sectors, in different provinces, with different target groups to find out, A, what is the potential, what is being realized, and how it is going to be used. So please wait for some time, maybe 3 to 6 months, where we can get some initial responses on that. And I would definitely like to respond to this gentleman separately as well.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. There is, I'm trying to organize the questions a little bit within a logical order, and we have we have several questions pertaining to mainstreaming and the mobilization of the private sector. And I'd like to ask you all, how do you see an ongoing mobilization from different types of companies on the road to COP15? Coalitions being built, for example, there are at the international level, but we're wondering in the chat box whether in India or in the region overall, do you see some movement over there? And whether yes or no, there's a question of how to scale this up in the I would say mainstreaming question, and how do you think we could better organize this mobilization, and what would be needed to have a stronger commitment from different companies to implementing the post-2020 framework? It's not an easy one. Who would like to start?
I can start, and I'll provide some general comments. I think that one of the key elements in mainstreaming is the efforts that needs to be made to better have financial tool, both in terms of associating the right value to nature as an asset. So it's national accounts, it's environmental goods and services, it is financial disclosure and risk management from financial statement from private sector. So if we set up all those tools that associate and treat nature as an asset, just like any other asset, and you can see that, like, I'm really taken by a report published earlier this week by McKinsey and company about valuation of nature and the need to do that. So those are not necessarily the type of people that you associate with defense of conservation. They're typically the one that are sitting in the boardrooms of our companies and advising them. So I'm really I'm expecting loud advice from NGOs and civil society. It's new to see a private sector organization, ones whose livelihood depend on the credibility they have with their clients, the business, getting into this and providing a strong message. So I think that's the starting point. Then we're gonna see how the mega diverse countries will become the mega rich countries, because they're doing mega evaluation of their assets, including this region. Thank you.
Anyone, for example?
Yes, Alex?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's interesting how actually COVID-19 has waken up some of the private sector, especially those that were affected, whose businesses have been affected by COVID directly or indirectly. And we've had some invitations for here in the Philippines. For example, we have had an invitation, we received an invitation from an energy company, for example, to explain to them, you know, how did this happen? You know, how did it come to this? And we always, you know, we highlight again, it's important to highlight, you know, the consequences of what happened to nature, and then eventually how it led to the losses that they are feeling now. And it's an opportunity that we are taking so that they can be more conscious and aware that really nature, biodiversity should not just be part of their corporate social responsibility, but should already be part of their business models. And if you value these impacts, as Basile said, you know, it could come to millions of dollars, and that if you monetize this, and so that's something that's important to highlight with the businesses and even the tourism industry now. I mentioned earlier, you know, we keep on emphasizing that, you know, a lot, and even the industries that depended on tourism has been affected. And, you know, we know that after the pandemic, people will want to go back to nature, and we should be ready for that. So we keep emphasizing that eventually, you know, we also need to sustain the main source of their their revenue, their businesses. So that has to be emphasized. We have to take the opportunity to emphasize this point at this time, and that has provided that has allowed us to engage more businesses and industries to now take into account biodiversity in their business models. In fact, this afternoon, before this meeting again, this morning before this meeting, we also had I was invited to be a judge by the Philippine Chamber of Commerce to select some top industries who are taking into account environment in their business processes. So it's interesting how our situation has actually the current crisis has actually opened the eyes of some of these businesses, and we need to be able to latch on this interest and see how we can work better with them, so that to guide them towards a better decision making in the future for their business, not just for those for us who are working on conservation.
Thank you, Teresa. I see a comment in the chat box. Thank you, Ravindra Singh, mentioning in the case of India that there is a very active business and biodiversity initiative, and whose membership represents 4% of India's GDP. So that's also probably actors with whom to engage further on the road to GBF. I'm looking at the time, and there are also different points that relate to the health relationship and questions of communication. And so I will blend them together and ask you all, because we've touched upon this earlier around issues of One Health. There's also a question whether we should talk about planetary health and to really anchor the environmental aspects further in these discussions. I was wondering, so as especially Sunita, you made it pretty clear in your presentation that there was on the side of Indian actors, there was a feeling that the health aspects were not reflected sufficiently in the current drafts of the post-2020 biodiversity framework. And so I was wondering, I have maybe two interconnected questions, or maybe three connected points, which would be, how do you think we could, what could we do in the coming months to, I would say at the same time, strengthen the communication of the biodiversity dimension of health issues and especially of the current pandemics, and within this movement at the same time, I would say strengthen the place of health issues in the draft text, and maybe Basile, you have some ideas on that, on whether we could or should or how to, and I would say in the as a last point, because I was really I find it very interesting. I mean, the story you told, Sunita, that there was maybe a stronger demand on the ground from practitioners that what at the even national, but I would say international level, for example, environmental constituencies are not really strongly involved in the governance of the One Health initiative, for example. So there's probably also progress to be made in how then in the governance of health, we better include these aspects. So I would move like, how do we better communicate on this importance? How do we reflect that in the CBD conversation? But then how also maybe we can reach out to broader levels concerning health governance worldwide. And then After we finish this round of answers, Vinod, if you wanted to have some concluding remarks, that would be an excellent wrap-up for this excellent conversation. So the floor is to whoever wants to take it first. Basile, your mic is switched off. Ah, so go ahead. As you wish. I'll let you choose.
Basile first, and then I can come in. Let's have the big picture first.
No, you know, health and the GDF. So they're very clearly, I think all experts recognize that there is a strong link between health of our planet, the health of humans, and a healthy environment. There is other factors. So we should do the nature part of the health equation as good as we should, and we should do it 100%. But we should not pretend that we're 100% of the solution. There is other issues outside. So I think those are a bit of the bookshelf hand on the two sides. So what is in the middle is definitively addressing several factors that are recognized: the ecosystem, protected area, species stress, and human wildlife contact. So those are the elements we can play with. How we address that in the framework, there is going to be some very interesting discussion at the next substance on health, and that's going to give us the trigger to make whatever change party will want in the framework. At this point in time, we have not had the discussion, so the way we could make change in the framework was relatively limited. Remember, our mandate was to reflect the discussion that took place in Rome, which was really at the quasi before the crisis. So nevertheless, there is 3 or 4 places in the framework that we've strengthened the health. I think that's probably the better way is to reflect it into specific places rather than have a specific target. If you allow me then, now, one aspect of that response to the health crisis is the long-term versus short-term, and there was a question about that in the question list. I think there is no question that governments need to take action now to save people and to redress the economy. And we cannot wait until the end of the negotiation. And I think all of us are influencing our national governments to make sure that the decisions they're taking are decisions that are bio-proofed, to add to my vocabulary one word from today. So definitively we cannot wait, and this is not a question of short-term versus long-term. We got to do both. So there is no choice. So thank you. Over to you, Sunita.
Yeah, thank you, Basile. So I was just going to, I agree totally with the point you made that the linkages to health should actually probably really spread throughout the framework. So one of the things that we've realized is through the work that's been done by many researchers, is that the global burden of disease has now shifted. Okay, so it's now the non-communicable diseases that are becoming much more prominent. That it's becoming a burden, and there are very clear correlations that are being made to show that access to nature and to various contributions from nature actually helps to address several health issues, and therefore, so and health includes food and nutrition. It includes mental health. It includes access to cultural, to natural spaces. So it's a whole suite of things, including the whole One Health. Environment, animal and human health linkages. So it's important that, and as Dr. Teresa mentioned, this is a good opportunity. So the crisis has become a good opportunity because people see these linkages much more vividly because it has affected them. They want to know the reasons, and the reasons come back and hit bang on the environment on the careless way or the callous way we've dealt with environmental issues. So and biodiversity issues. So that health, human well-being is dependent on the integrity of ecosystems, on the availability of diversity of biological resources has become much more clear now. And therefore, it is up to all of us in our own different capacities to be saying this, taking this message and communicating it with multiple stakeholders we see, because we are all decision makers in many ways. Policymakers, of course, have a big say while the negotiations are going on and in that, but other stakeholders have a big influence on what these policymakers would eventually say too. So there's an important role for all of us to play in our interactions with multiple stakeholder groups, including local communities, including the private sector, and such. The other group that we need to be communicating very closely with is the health sector itself. So for instance, the WHO and all of the other bodies associated, because the CBD and the WHO do have a joint work program on health and biodiversity. There is a lot of stuff that they've come out with, some very, very useful, very, very important information out there that they're trying to advocate for. But it's also got to come from there. You know, the interest has to come, that the push has to come from there, so to strengthen the hands of the framework or the development of the framework and its implementation. So there's quite a bit of advocacy that we need to do to engage them to become more proactive in the discussions that we have on this count. And I think there was a point that was raised about planetary health, and yes. I mean, there was some. I made a very indirect reference to a systemic approach. So it's looking at systems, at the socio-ecological system, but looking at how various aspects related to our well-being, so to say, the whole concept of the planetary boundaries, how they're all interlinked. That's what it shows, that health is linked to the health of to the integrity of all of the systems actually working together and working in a synergistic fashion. That we are resilient, so we know that there are vulnerabilities, that there can be shocks, there can be disturbances, but we also find a way to get back to a point of equilibrium. I'll pause there.
Okay, thank you, Sunita. I would come in for the last few minutes. We have our interpreters waiting to go. So,
sorry, did Teresa have any last word? Just to make sure.
Oh, Teresa, please come in. I'm sorry.
I'm okay. We worked with Sunita on One Health.
Okay, yeah. Thank you so much. And we know each other's mind as well. So see, very interesting discussions taking place in the last 2 hours. Some very important perspective on the framework. But as is happening all over the world, the entire discussions are governed by the pandemic and the need to deal with the post-pandemic situation over there. So taking advantage of Brazil's presence over here, I think we need to continue to work to see that how does the framework respond to the pandemic. I don't want to scare anyone, but I would like to add that we say emerging and re-emerging infectious disease. So see, do not forget that if we deal with one pandemic, there is no guarantee that the other one will not come in. I wish it doesn't, but we need to make our system strong so that we are able to deal with this pandemic and any other pandemics to come. And therefore, in our deliberations in the coming months, we need to see that how each of our action point is in line with the real pandemic and the pandemic which might come, which might re-emerge over there. Interestingly, till some time back, we were talking of climate proofing everything. Everything had to be climate proofed. And that's what our colleagues in the climate change debate told us. And now the biodiversity people are saying that please be aware of biodiversity proofing of all the economic stimulus packages. Because if we don't do that, then we run the risk of causing further damage to our recovery process. So that is the line we need to take. And as Basile said, that this region in the world, the South and Southeast Asia, the communities are very important, and we need to hold more consultations with them and see that their perspectives are also factored in the both the action points and the targets and the indicators that we develop, so that the communities feel that they have not been shortchanged in the process, and their views and their voices have been heard. So with these words, I would like to thank everyone, my three panelists over there, and then Aleksandar in particular, and all the participants who have stood for more than 2 hours in doing that. And I am sure that these have been recorded. So anybody who has not been able to log on, as we say, can have the benefit of hearing it. So with these words, I thank you once again. And for last 15 seconds, I hand it over back to Aleksandar, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Just a big word of thank you, and looking forward to pursuing all of these very important conversations. And just to mention that indeed, the recording will be available online. And if you all agree with your slides as well, and so that we will increase the shelf life of this conversation and increase the accessibility to even more participants. So thank you so much. Have a good rest of the day, a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Yeah, take care.